Um, Good day to everyone. I'm absolutely delighted to be joined by Brett Walker from Collette Vacations, who's the current chairman of the Canadian Tour Operators Association, and we're here to talk about many things. But first of all, thank you so much for joining us today, Brett.
Appreciate it, Tom. Nice to be here.
Okay. Well, I think first of all, it would be really interesting to know a little bit about CATO. Sorry, a little bit about Collette. I'd be interested to know how long you've been going. I mean, you're a famous brand, but for those of you who are not wholly familiar with you, it might be quite interesting to know a little bit about what your operations are, where you go, how long you've been running.
Yeah, real quickly. Right, my day job is working for Collette. I oversee our global operations. Collette is based. We have a large footprint around the world. We're based primarily in just outside of Providence, Rhode Island. We are a guided tour operator. That's what we do. We operate both small and large group tours around the world to all 7 continents. Importantly, we are the oldest family-owned tour company in North America. Have been family-owned since 1918, and obviously that's a long time. And we've, like we are having to deal with currently, we've been through a lot of issues, not the least of which we've been through the last few years. But yeah, so that's really a bit about Collette. We do one thing well, and that's primarily large and small group touring.
That's great. And I dare say, if you look back over a 104-year time frame, a pandemic is severe, but it's not as bad as the first pandemic you lived through, and it's not as difficult as the Second World War, I imagine. So, hey, it's good to put things in perspective.
Well, yeah, I guess the only difference, Tom, would be that, in the first pandemic, we were a fledgling company, and there wasn't all of certainly the world has changed a lot. I never, in my tenure, I should say that I've been with Collette almost 35 years. I began in 1989, and you may recall, anyone who's been around for a while, we've at that time when I first began, we were dealing with the Gulf War I, Gulf War II, and then in obviously 9/11, which was sort of maybe the biggest mark on me, because I was still quite green. But in fact, the largest disruption we'd had between when I began and now was really the ash cloud, over Europe, right? That was better part of 10 days. And I couldn't imagine ever, that we'd have something that would extend longer than that, but we have, and I'm happy to say that we're going to get through it, and it's been difficult, but we're going to get through it. So here we go.
And I agree entirely. I think the current crisis is partly obliterated from our collective memory things like 86, 91, 2001, which were momentous events, and indeed the Icelandic ash cloud, which caused all kinds of problems. I for one was stranded in Madrid, but I know there were lots of people stranded throughout Europe. It was really tricky. But this
Tom, I was on a flight to Zurich, and one with my family, was one of the last flights into London Heathrow before it was emptied out, with 2 kids, both under, I guess maybe 8 at the time. And you can imagine what it was like trying to find a hotel room or a car rental. And it was, but in light of, it's a first world problem. It was a wonderful experience. We spent 10 days in the UK that we were not planning to, and had an incredible trip, maybe one of the best family vacations ever. But it was easier to make something good of that. The last few years have been really, really tough to make anything good of. But as an industry, we have incredible resolve, and we'll bounce back.
Tell me about CATO. I dare say it says what it does on the tin, but how long has it been going, and what is its mission?
Well, CATO has been around for many decades. Predominantly what we do, Tom, is advocacy, and but we do other things. We are engaged in it's a membership group, obviously, primarily composed of tour operators, much like yourself, and other supporting members, which could be tourism boards or others. But most of the work that we're doing, and certainly almost all of the work that we're doing now, is advocacy. Working with government, both federally and prior to the pandemic, really more provincially, because at least here in Canada, most of the industry regulations is determined by the local jurisdiction, the province. So we happen to be here in Ontario, where I'm based. It happens to be quite a highly regulated travel environment. But obviously through the pandemic, the real issues that we've had have been, number one, support for an industry which has been decimated, and those who are employed within it, as well as obviously the border issues and testing. So essentially that's what we've been engaged with for the last 24 months.
But on the point of view of consumer law, I mean, you're saying that you'd really have to educate us. I mean, in Europe, for example, and we do cover some European sales, there are very strict criteria on bonding requirements and liability insurance requirements. Is it the same thing in Canada? I mean, and you'll say it varies from province to province. Well,
there's 3 provinces in particular, Tom, that are highly regulated. One being Ontario, where I'm based, and Collette is based. The other being British Columbia and Quebec. And yes, probably much like in the UK, certainly, each of those 3 provinces has a travel regulator. You need to be licensed to sell travel. There is a consumer protection fund for which we all pay into. It's wholly inadequate, quite frankly. And that's been a big issue for, quite frankly, prior to the pandemic. That was really our issue, the fact that we have a consumer protection fund, which is well intended, and the industry actually supports. I'm a big believer that consumer protection can actually be a competitive advantage, but there's no point in having consumer protection if it's inadequately funded, and quite frankly, it cannot be funded by industry. It needs to be funded by the consumer, and so that was really almost everything that we were engaged with prior to the pandemic, was working with the government in Ontario and elsewhere to make sure that these consumer protection funds were funded appropriately and by in the right manner.
And the protection fund presumably is there to protect the consumer in the event of insolvency, and to facilitate repatriation and refund if they're actually on vacation when the insolvency happens.
That's right. But these at least a lot of the legislation and certainly the regulations were written, decades ago. Yeah. So the restrictions that are in place, you have a consumer protection fund for which it's promoted as protecting one's money, but the caps which are in place, it's 5,000 per person maximum, 5 million per event here in Ontario. If you ever had a major insolvency, you're going to, consumers would get pennies on the dollar. And I don't think anyone would be very happy about that. So when we come out of this, I think we will, when we put the pandemic to our back, I think we'll go back to advocating for consumer protection, enhanced consumer protection, and paid for by the consumer, which Quebec, quite frankly, is a real shining example of how they do it. They have a consumer protection fund, which is, certainly in excess of 100 million, quite frankly more. I think it's approaching 200 million. It's funded by the users. It's basically $1 on 1,000, which isn't a lot, and the consumers can feel confident that if they're booking with a tour operator in Quebec, that their money is truly protected, which is not the case elsewhere.
Okay, and does it also? I mean, for instance. Do you have to take liability as principal? I mean, if something happened to the consumer on tour, the consumer can return to the tour operator and say, look, this is what happened to me, and you're liable for it. You can't turn around and say, well, actually, that was one of the suppliers, you need to take them to court. I mean, is there a sort of primary obligation to? Okay, that's interesting.
Yeah, the primary obligation is to the tour operator, and you're quite right that these funds which we're talking about protect the consumer only insofar as insolvency.
Yeah. Okay. But if but if they were to come to any grief through the fault or through the fault of one of the suppliers, do they take the tour operator to court, or do they take the supplier to court?
Tom, they always take the tour operator to court because because they can.
Okay, well, that's true. They're there. No, it's a long-running saga in Europe that the one of the provisions of the package travel directive, which applies even now in the UK, even though we've left the European Union, but certainly within continental Europe, the tour operator is absolutely liable as principal for the function of their suppliers. They can't claim to be an agent in that respect. They say, you know, this product was bought off the tour operator, and the tour operator sold it, and the tour operator is liable for all the components. Well, look, I mean, that's the regulatory environment. There were a very quick sketch of it. We know that we've got a lot of work to do with impending problems concerning German VAT next year, and the prospects of reform of the the tour operators margin scheme potentially applying to extraterritorial bodies such as Canadian tour operators. But you know, and I know that we're engaged in conversation on that, and we'll be briefing people in due course on this. I think more interestingly, CATO, I mean, what have your members have obviously been experiencing the mother of all nightmares like we all have over the last 2 years. Has there been any domestic business that you've been able to switch to? And I suppose that's really just for background. The real interest is what the return is looking like at the moment for Europe. I mean, are people rebooking? Are they coming back? Are they new bookings? What's happening?
So let me try and parse a few things, because it's Tom. Number one, Canada is a very, it's a small but important market, mm-hmm. And we're also a northern market. And as a tour operator, I will tell you that we knew when we tried to pivot during this pandemic. We knew if you're a tour operator based in Canada and you tried to pivot to a domestic travel, it was going to be a horrible failure. You have a country that's, approximately 40 million people in a northern climate. And of course, we are all scaled in this business to an international, a global, most of us are scaled to, certainly Collette is scaled to a global market. So to turn from that to, trying to promote Canada only to Canadians, we knew would be a horrible, there's no sustenance in that. And so, and no one, I can tell you across the board from any of our members had any success in doing that. So we need to get back to international travel. And Canada, although a small market, is typically a very important source market for many countries. We're not maybe in the top 5, but we're quite often in the top 10 because Canadians are ardent travelers and are ready to go. However, apart from what many of your constituents may have been seeing with the trucker convoys and whatnot in Ottawa and across the country, Canadians are a remarkably compliant group, if you will. And so a lot of the messaging from our government has been do not travel, and quite frankly remained to be so until about 2 weeks ago, when the current federal advisory against non-essential travel will be changing end of this month. So currently we have an advisory, and for the last few years, other than a brief few months, the federal advisory was telling Canadians to do not travel for non-essential reasons. And also, we have roughly around a 5,000 long 5,000 kilometer long border with the U.S., which we have anyone who lives in Canada typically lives within a very close proximity of that border. I certainly do. The notion of never having been over that border for me in the last few years, it's just notionally, you can't even imagine that anyone would have told me at any point that you won't be traveling to the U.S., to Buffalo, Detroit, to wherever, flying, whatever, in a period of time that we've had. And I think that had a huge psychological effect on Canadians because that border is everywhere. Now, couple of things have happened, very important for your constituents, for your members, for everyone listening. We had an announcement about 2 years, sorry, I got 2 years. We had an announcement about 2 weeks ago that a couple of things were going to be changing, which I think will have a huge effect on outbound travel. Number one, and this has an impact both on Canadians traveling outbound as well as people traveling to Canada. The requirement for PCR testing within 72 hours of their departure flight from wherever to Canada has not been lifted, but there is now the option of taking a rapid test within 24 hours. So I can tell you that that PCR testing was a huge deterrent to Canadians traveling or thinking about booking outbound. The fact that they now have the option of PCR testing within 72 hours, or what everyone will default to will be the rapid test within 24 hours, is huge. Not only for a lot of reasons, as we all know. I mean, it's not just the cost of the PCR testing, but it's where you are and can you get it. And so that was number one. Number two, I think the fact that the federal advisory against non-essential travel is being lifted, and we are returning to what would otherwise be a fairly normal advisory. We have, oh, well, the other big thing I just want to is prior to this, well, in the current environment, until the end of the month, anyone traveling, any returning Canadians or anyone traveling to Canada was subject to arrival testing. And now, while that has not been lifted, the real issue with that, Tom, was the fact that until now, if you were chosen, you actually had to quarantine until the results were known. Well, if anyone's thinking of traveling to Canada, or quite frankly, any Canadian is traveling outbound, when they know that they may be subject to arrival testing and quarantine, that doesn't fly, because people don't think about the getting lucky and getting through. They think about what happens if I test, and I've already, apart from the fact that I've already had a test before getting on a plane, I got to test again. I regardless of whether I'm positive or negative, I have to quarantine for 2, 3, 4 days until the result. That's gone away. And one other thing that's important to your constituents, anyone now traveling with children 12 or under who may or may not be vaccinated do not have to quarantine on the return. And that's a game changer for families. So anyone who is thinking about booking a family trip with young children do not have to worry about that anymore. So I think we're going to see bookings pick up. We are really, I can tell you, taking my CATO hat off, Tom, and putting my Collette hat on, we are seeing that trending immediately. Yeah. Now, the advanced purchase window that I'm sure we share with many of your members, it's not always 2 months down the road. It may be for some. Generally, we're looking at anywhere between a 4 and 6 month booking window. But nonetheless, it's better to be talking about future travel than none at all.
Yeah. And have you got a number of people who had to cancel their 2020 and I dare say 2021 trips being rescheduled into 2022? I mean, there is a minor debate as to whether a lot of the people who are booking or who are on the books legacy bookings really from 2020, or if they're new bookings, real new interest.
Well, there's no doubt there's two parts to this. So in terms of those who are currently booked, those legacy bookings, absolutely. That has been a push forward demand. Those people who were booked in 2020 may have rebooked for 2021, couldn't travel, booked again for 2022 or possibly 2023. So there's been all of that. And that's why 2022 could be a very, very healthy year because we've had some attrition, if you will, for the months of January and February. We're not seeing that anymore. So the attrition is waning here in Canada, largely because of the announcement, which I just spoke about, and people are feeling that they can and want to travel. Now, in terms of the current bookings, Tom, it's really interesting because one of the things we are seeing bookings pick up. Interestingly, right now, and again, I'm speaking with my Collette hat on. We don't at CATO share this type of information readily. but I don't mind sharing with you all that we are seeing a higher proportion of our current bookings that are new travelers to Collette than repeat. So that's a very, very positive trend. The fact that we have so many new customers. What that might suggest is that our, to use your word, Tom, our legacy customers might be a little bit more hesitant right now. And we are not yet at trending at levels that we were trending at in 2019, but the booking trends are definitely getting close, especially in the U.S. From the U.S. market, which will probably surpass 2019 booking trends, I would imagine, in the next few weeks. So yeah, interesting, a lot going on, but it's one very important point of the fact that right now we're seeing a lot of new customers as opposed to those people who may have booked with Collette before.
I mean, that's very heartening. And I have to say, it's a picture which, if I understand our research correctly, and we're going to be releasing research next week, is actually broadly reflected in North America. People are genuinely heartened by the volume of bookings they're getting on the scheduled tour trips. So this is, there appears to be some real pent-up demand out there. And some people worry that this is a temporary phenomenon, that this is just people who are rescheduling their vacations from 2 years ago, or coming because they just couldn't go last year. But I would say, look, excuse me, if you're wanting to rebuild an industry, and we're rebuilding an industry, you do it with people. We've got bookings coming through, and that's what we need. We need people.
Absolutely. And Tom, make no doubt about it. The Canadian market is well behind the U.S. market, and I don't think that's a surprise to anyone. We've had restrictions like, and many of our larger urban areas like Toronto and Montreal have been under lockdown for a long, long time. So the Canadian market is going to rebound. Now we're going to see a surge in Canadians booking, whereas we may have seen that surge much, much earlier out of the US.
Yeah.
And so I think this is I think everything we're talking about is extremely positive. We have the government working and legislating in our favor. And we have new bookings, and I suspect that what we will find in the coming weeks is those people who, many of the customers who had booked and have chosen to book with Collette many, many times will be the next cohort that begins to book.
That's great. Well, look, I'm going to finish with the one question that I'm being asked now all the time, which is the current situation in Eastern Europe. Is this having much of an impact on bookings? Presumably on Eastern European bookings, it's going to have a significant impact, but on Western Europe, is there any trace of any concern?
We're obviously, there's been some build up to this, but we've all had different expectations of what might happen. We are not seeing any major disruption yet, and I think really what it's going to come down to, Tom, is communication. Customers have got to know, whether you're traveling with Collette or any other member, that we have their back. We are not going to take them into any environment in which it's unsafe. I think we've proven through this pandemic that every operator is operating in a well-intentioned, safe, meaningful manner that will ensure the safety of every guest. It's tough to say whether it will have any medium to long term. I don't think so. I really don't. There may be certain proximate destinations, right, where I don't need to mention any, but there could be some where you'll see a bit of an impact. But I really do think it gets back to this demand recovery. People want to travel, and they'll travel where they believe they can. Some may choose a different destination for that reason. But ultimately, I don't think it's going to have any effect on demand recovery.
No, I think I've been asked to reflect on it, and I'm reasonably clear that the difference between this and, for instance, the terrorism threat is that the terrorism threat is inherently massive and unknown, whereas the disruption we're seeing at the moment ghastly though it is in Eastern Europe, is very specific and very localized. And if you look in the past, if you draw an arc really up from the Baltic, sorry, the Adriatic Sea up to the Baltic, you can just tick off the major incidents that have occurred over the last 50 years. We've had or 70 years. We've had the Hungarian uprising being crushed. We've had the Prague Spring being crushed. We've had the Berlin Wall being erected. We've had martial law declared in Poland. We've had a full land war in the former Yugoslavia in the 90s. And even if you look further west and look at all the troubles in Northern Ireland that ran from the late 60s through to the 90s, these were well publicized, but North Americans traveled, and there was no inhibition on growth, really.
I totally agree. You're right. I don't mean to in any way diminish the seriousness of what is going on. We are all paying close attention to it, and it's having a major effect on everyone, but emotionally and otherwise. But I really do not. I agree. I don't think it will have an effect, much of an effect in terms of looking forward the next 12, 16, 18 months, whether people will choose to travel or not. I think there's just too much desire, and people are also talking a lot about mental health. Families need to get away. Families need to visit, friends and relatives, and even if it's not simply a leisure trip. But I think we're going to have a lot of, we're trending very, very well. We're very happy with how things are going. We'll continue to obviously monitor. But long term, I think I'm very, very hopeful, and I'm optimistic for a great recovery.
Brett, thank you so much. We're out of time. We're way out of time, but it's been so interesting. We've been letting it run on. Thank you so much for spending time with us, and we really hope a very successful year for you and for CATO. Thank you very much.
I appreciate it, Tom. Have a good one.
Bye-bye.